Hi and welcome back to part 4 of this Blender tutorial series on rigging a motorbike. In part 3 we dealt with our suspension controls, making sure that they work both for the ground sensors and with our actual suspension widget. In part 4 we're going to be adding our steering controls as well as our drift controls as well. So let's jump straight into it. Firstly, we're going to add our steering control bone. So we're just going to add a new bone, making sure we're on the controls collection. We're going to rotate this around so it's pointing forwards, and we're just going to move it out to about here. We're going to parent this to the root, and we're going to go into pose mode, and we can add our widget for the steering. Next, we need to add a mechanical bone for the steering. So we're going to go to our mechanical collection, and we're going to duplicate our front wheel. I'm just going to scale it up a bit. Yeah, 1.5 will do. We're going to rename this mechanical steering, which we're going to parent to the axis, which it already is, which is great. The only thing we need to do is go into pose mode and yeah, cool, just making sure that we don't have any bone constraints on that. The bone constraint we're going to add to it is going to be a damp track to our, it's going to be to our bike rig, and we're going to damp track it to our steering, which I didn't name, it turns out. Steering, there we go. And we're going to damp track that to the steering in the negative Y axis. So when we move this, our steering, mechanical steering turns around. And let's just lock the Y and Z values for all of these, so I can only move this in the X axis. We now need to set up some mechanical bones around our handlebars to control the rotation of the handlebars. So this is going to be a bit of a slightly confusing one, because what we're going to do is we're going to basically have to have two different rotation bones to deal with the fact that the rotation of the suspension is offset from the rotation of the handlebars. But we want to ensure that when we turn the handlebars, they're rotating correctly around the right axis. This will make sense in a second once I start adding these bones. So first of all, I'm going to take the mechanical handlebars bone, I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm just going to scale it up 1.5, and we're going to call this mechanical handlebars rotation. Now what we need to do is have another bone that's going to be able to control the rotation of the steering, the rotation of the suspension, sorry, but making sure it's still along that axis of the suspension. So the easy way to do this is we're going to take the deformation handlebars bone, we're going to duplicate it, flip it, and then we're just going to move it up in the y-axis. And this is going to be our mechanical suspension front rotation. And we want to parent that to the mechanical handlebars. So the reason that we're doing this is that if I go back into pose mode, you can see immediately this has flipped the direction because we duplicated it from the handlebars, which means it's still got that damp track constraint on it. So let's delete that. I deleted it from the wrong one. Where's it gone? It's this one, isn't it? Yeah, the suspension rotation. Get rid of that. So now we basically have these bones that when I move our suspension, we have the rotation bone that's following along with it, but we also have the suspension rotation that's offset, that's also along our suspension axis, but it's still following the handlebars. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the handlebar rotation we're going to add a transformation constraint, which you'll remember from the last part allows us to map rotations or any transformations from one bone to another. So we're going to go with mechanical steering bone. We want to control the rotation of this. In local space, we're going to do -90 to 90 Z rotation. And what axis do we want to rotate this in? Well, we want to rotate it in the Y axis, so it's rotating like this. So in our Y axis, let's flip this around. We're going to go -90 to 90. We now need to make sure that the mechanical handlebars, which are basically controlling, because the deformation handlebars are parented to it, we want to make sure that the mechanical handlebars are going to be copying the rotation of the handlebar rotation bone. And we're going to leave that in world space. So now, if I start moving this widget, those handlebars start rotating, which is exactly what we want. But now we need to make sure that the suspension is also following it. And this is where, as I said, that kind of offset angle where you've got the handlebars kind of coming down like this, and then you've got this kind of offset, and then the suspension coming down here. This is where this starts to cause a problem, because if you see, if I move this, well, the rotation of our suspension, it can't just rotate along its own y-axis, because like the suspensions aren't going to line up. So this is why we've got that secondary bone here. And now what we can do is, for the mechanical suspension front, we are going to copy the rotation of the suspension rotation in just the y-axis. We're going to change this to local with parent, and we're going to move it first. So first it's going to copy the rotation, and then it's going to track. And now it still doesn't quite line up and work. Why is that? Well, it's because I forgot to change this I've changed it to local with parent on the target, but not on the owner as well. So now, if I move these, you'll see that the suspension is perfectly rotating with the handlebars, and is maintaining the kind of correct orientation. We now need to just fix the front wheel. And to do that, we're going to look at the deformation collection to our deformation wheel. And this is a problem with something that we set up in the last part, where we set our copy location to the deformation and the rotation to the wheel. Well, we don't actually want this now. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to delete the copy location, and we're actually just going to parent it to the suspension instead. And then on the constraints for our rotation, we're just going to rotate along the x-axis. And now, if I turn my controls back on, and it looks like I had this bone on the wrong layer, or the wrong collection. Now, if I do this, our wheel follows perfectly, which is exactly what we want. And finally, to wrap up this part, we're going to add the drift function. So really easily, we're just going to go into edit mode on our controls collection, add a new bone. I'm going to rotate it down here so it's at the base of the front wheel. I'm going to call this drift. We can go into pose mode and add our drift widget. And we just need to rotate this 180 in the z-axis, and we're just going to move it back in the y-axis. so it's at the correct position. And all we need to do for this is to take the background sensor and parent that to the drift, and we're also going to parent the stretch bone to the drift as well. Drift, there we go. Now if I go back into pose mode, turn off my mechanical collection, and I can lock the transformations, so it's only able to rotate in the Z-axis. And now we have a nice drift function that can drift the bike around, and that's still going to rotate around that central thread where the handlebars are, because of the way that we set up that handlebar rotation earlier. And so that's it for part 4 of this rigging a motorbike tutorial. Join me in the next part, where we're going to add a little bit of extra functionality so that when we turn our steering, the entire bike is going to tilt along its axis like this, giving a bit of a lean into corners. So yeah, join me in part 5, and thanks for watching.